next speaker is Dr. Nidhi Sitapati. She is from the University of Pennsylvania. So, Dr. Nidhi, if you are here, perhaps you could start sharing.
Hey
Yes,
everyone. So can you all see my slides?
yes, yes.
Okay, great. Let me get started then. So today I'm going to talk about our work on data-driven automatic infant neuromotor disorder detection. There's two components to this work. One is sort of mostly software-based, which we plan to deploy through a mobile app. And then there's also both hardware and software-based multimodal sensor system. I've spent most of my time working on the software part of it, so I'll talk mostly about that. But since there's a lot of interest in sort of physical systems also in this crowd, I'll also give you some summaries for some of the work we've been doing in developing a sort of low cost hardware system to go with our software. So neuromotor disorders cause lifelong disability in can cause lifelong disability in infants, but they can be detected early. Around 5 to 10% of children are affected by developmental disorders. Cerebral palsy occurs in 2 per 1,000 live births, and in low and middle income countries, this number may be even higher. Early detection is really important for these sort of neurodevelopmental disorders like cerebral palsy. It's also difficult to do early detection without sort of in-person assessment. And that's really why we decided to develop the kinds of tools that we're developing here. So there's really a need for a quantified, sensitive, and accessible diagnostic test to be able to do early diagnosis. The current sort of state of the clinical field relies on expert assessment by a trained clinician. So it's very easy for a lot of sort of infants, especially those who don't have access to hospitals, um, easily to go sort of undetected, or who don't have access to these expert clinicians. So our sort of ultimate goal for this project is to have an app that all parents can download on their phone, take videos of their babies as they're moving, and then that can help to sort of screen them for risk of neurodevelopmental disorders. And then of course, if the screen comes out positive, then they'll be directed to a clinician. And so this way, we hope to capture more infants. So that's sort of the long term goal that we're working towards. There's been some past work on using just frame differencing and optic flow. However, the problem with optic flow based frame differencing is it gives only sort of gross movement. It doesn't give details about the individual sort of body parts of the baby. And it can also be computationally intensive depending on how sort of limb information is extracted after doing just optic flow. So we are going to use computer sort of like data-driven computer vision for this project, not frame differencing or optic flow. So the sort of broad way that we hope to assess risk based on a video of an infant is the following. So we will have a database of normative or healthy infant movements, and then we will then record a new infant's movement in a clinical setting, and then we'll ask the question, so what is the probability that this new infant's movements are drawn from this set of healthy movements that we've collected earlier. And that sort of probability is used as a proxy for the risk. And then that will be compared to some sort of clinical standard test to see how well our measure of risk performs. So we first started by curating a database of normative infant movements. We started because this was sort of a pilot study, which we are currently doing on a much larger scale. We started by just collecting YouTube videos of babies. So basically searched for babies that are 1 to 6 months old, And we included videos where the infants were where their movements were independent, meaning that the parent is not a parent or caregiver is not sort of holding the infant's hands and making them move, and trying to make sure that it was that the videos were non-occluded, and we wanted the full body present in the frame for at least 6 seconds. And with that, we found 385 videos in total, and then only 85 sort of qualified for our inclusion criteria. This route of using YouTube is that this is because we're using computer vision for the study, this is sort of a quick way to pilot a hypothesis without having to actually collect data. And so we thought that was like a promising way to test if our framework is even sort of meaningful to work on further. So for collecting the infant movements in a clinical setting, we collaborated with clinicians from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and all the participants had to provide informed consent. Um, Again, the criterion here was the same age criterion, 1 to 6 months. They cannot walk and don't have any sort of cardiac or orthopedic history. We used basically GoPro videos from 2 different angles to record the infant's movements in supine position, which is lying on their back. And then also our clinical collaborators provided us with a Bailey Infant Neurodevelopmental Screener score to assess risk. And out of a total of 19 clinical infants that we assessed, 5 were low risk, 9 were moderate risk, and 5 were high risk. Finally, to actually extract the pose from the videos, we sort of leveraged some advances in computer vision based pose estimation, based human pose estimation. So the way that these algorithms work is that they're trained on these large scale data sets, like human labeled data sets of people sort of in natural environments. And of course, most of the, they're not trained on a lot of infant data. So so the vanilla version of the algorithm didn't do well on infant data. So we needed to do some retraining. So that's what I'll talk about next. So the way that we did the retraining, or what's called domain adaptation, is that we included the first 10 seconds of 103 YouTube videos and the first 30 seconds of around 17 clinical videos in our training and test sort of data set. The key points were labeled using a key point labeling framework called VATIC. And we basically had around 10,000 frames in total, and 8,000 were included in the training set and 1,000 in the validation set. And we did gradient descent, basically fixed the first few layers from OpenPose, and then just retrained the last layer to improve the performance on infants. And then the performance did improve on our infant videos. So here's an example video of how it performs on sort of a video of a baby. We really wanted to our focus with this sort of retrained algorithm was to have the performance be good on sort of real world videos with natural backgrounds and sort of different colored clothing, different colored like skin color, and which is also why we wanted to go with YouTube for this study, because since our ultimate goal is a mobile app, we wanted these algorithms can be very sensitive to differences in backgrounds and clothing and so on. So which is why we wanted to be sure to give like a variability of sort of backgrounds and in colors for the algorithm in our training data. So once we got the data, we did some standard cleaning, outlier removal, smoothing. We also needed to deal with camera movements because a lot of these videos were captured by handheld cameras. And we did that by basically fixing a reference body part, which is the trunk. So in a lot of like in the 1 to 6 months age, there isn't a lot of sort of trunk movement that we saw. So we decided that, it would be fine to fix the trunk and then look at all the other movements relative to the trunk. And this also deals with any sort of camera movements, because we're assuming sort of all the camera movements is captured by the movements in the trunk. And we also had to do some normalizations as well. So after we cleaned the data, we also pre-registered our algorithm, because we're not working with a very large sort of data sample size here, even though it's much larger than typical movement science studies, which tend to be like in the 15 to 20 range. We had around 85 different infants in our YouTube data set, and then another around 19 in our clinical data set. So we decided to pre-register our algorithm. So pre-registering, I don't know if it's something that people are familiar with outside the sort of psychological and sort of biological sciences. So it's basically just pre-declaring what analyses we will run on our data set, so that there's no sort of scope for p-hacking and multiple hypothesis testing. So what we did is we basically based on literature about what variables really are good indicators of risk. We chose the following. We chose sort of absolute position and angle. We chose the variability in the positions and the angles of the movements. We chose the median speed, the variability in the speed, the variance of the acceleration, and also as a measure of symmetry, sort of the cross correlation between the left and the right movements. So if you try to visualize just these raw kinematic features, sort of in gray is our healthy or YouTube data set. And then in the colors are our clinical data set with 3 different levels of risk. And as you can see, nothing really comes out in the raw data set. If you just look at the raw data, and this is sort of the reason why we need more sort of sophisticated algorithm to tease out these differences. And it's also why, if you think about it, you end up needing a sort of expert clinician who's trained to sort of tease them out with their eyes. If it was sort of very obvious from here, then we would probably be able to detect it with our eyes as well. So what we did then is we wanted to sort of decompose the kinematic features with some unsupervised learning, just to see if they sort of cluster in some way, or if the sort of principal components tell us anything about sort of the separation along the different categories here, which is the reference database, the low risk, the moderate risk, and the high risk in our clinical database. And what we found is that in our sort of first vector direction, we're able to separate the reference database from the low, moderate, and high risk database, which is sort of, if you think about it, it's a bit concerning, because what it's saying is that our YouTube data, that are sort of in the data itself, you're able to tell what the YouTube data is versus the clinical data, which you ideally would not want. But we actually think it's a good thing that we're able to see this in the data itself, because then what we can do now is we can then remove this component that differentiates between them, to then sort of bring them on the same playing field, to then compare the two data sets together. So it's actually a good thing that you can sort of separate this out in the data itself. And then along this dimension sort of was what we really cared about, which is it sort of differentiated the high risk infants from the sort of reference low and moderate risk. So once we, so that was just sort of trying to visualize some sort of unsupervised clustering of the data. The next thing that we wanted to do is actually assess the risk, as I had introduced earlier. So we wanted to, so the way that we calculated the risk here is we calculated the naive Bayesian surprise metric as a proxy for the risk. So what we did is we assumed normal distribution and feature independence, and we estimated the log probability that a given infant's movements are drawn from the normative distribution. So what that says here is that so you're basically assessing, so you have some sort of distribution for healthy movements. And then you're asking the question, what is the probability that a new set of features is sort of derived from that distribution, and the negative log probability of that, and that is our measure of risk. So when we plot the z-score for that, what we find is we're not able to differentiate between sort of the low and moderate risk, but we are able to differentiate with the high risk infants, even with this sort of relatively small cohort. So we think this is promising, and we're currently, in the process of collecting much more data to be able to have the sort of statistical power to try more sophisticated algorithms, and also just have more statistical power in general for the findings. So in general, one reason that I wanted to speak here is that I think that pose estimation is a very sort of strong tool for deploying these kinds of cyber physical systems that interact with humans. And there are definitely some pitfalls and considerations when thinking about using pose estimation for automated neuromotor assessment or any other sort of human interaction, like human robot interaction, or having some software that's interacting with a human. It depends a lot on video quality. So there's always this trade-off between how sort of high resolution, high frame rate the video is, and then this amount of storage and compute needed to parse the video. So it's important to sort of decide what trade-off between those two works for your problem. It is thrown off by sort of, as I had mentioned, variability in the clothing and the background and the kinds of people that you're looking at. So it's really important. So you may need to do some domain adaptation for your use case depending on what you're trying to do. But again, it's important to strike a balance with, when you're doing the domain adaptation, make sure that the data set that you're adapting it on is representative of the sort of variability that you want the algorithm to perform on in when you deploy it, because these are neural networks, they do sort of when transfer learning is done, they don't always perform well on sort of the original data set that they were trained on. So they may lose some generality when you do the domain adaptation, and it's important to retain the amount of generality that you want. Another issue is, of course, camera angles. So trying to make sure that you're representing the desired sort of range of variability in camera angles. Some of these issues, especially with camera angles, goes away when you're trying to use, say, instead of, I spoke about 2D pose estimation today, but one thing that we're trying to do, the algorithms are trained on detecting directly 3D pose from 2D video data, and those can sort of, they have the potential to deal with things like camera angles better. And then, of course, minimizing the amount of occlusion and self-occlusion being like sort of relevant movements of the body being occluded by the body itself, and then external occlusions as well. And then having a way of dealing with handheld camera movements, especially if you're sort of relying on sort of person uploaded video data from an app or something like that. So I'll just talk about another sort of a short study we did as well. So so we created a data-driven pipeline for clinical movement assessment in the real world. We curated a database of sort of normative or healthy movements from YouTube, and our framework shows promise for distinguishing between different, at least the high risk level of clinician assessed risk. And actually, if you have a baby that's 1 to 6 months old, you can actually participate in the higher end version of this study by going of the baby, and we pay for participation as well. And then there's like more details about consent within the app. So please do participate if you'd like. So another sort of study that we're working on is the focus of the first part of the study that I've spoken about is purely on the motor side of development of sort of neurodevelopment, but emotion is also an important sort of signal for neurodevelopment in infants, and it's important for disorders like autism. And so we're currently working on incorporating both emotion and motion together to get some sort of measure of neurodevelopment. And one challenge with that we've started to try to address is that currently there aren't really algorithms out there that are good at classifying sort of infant emotion. There's a lot of work on sort of adults and detecting facial emotion automatically, but there isn't something specifically for infants. So we wanted to develop that. So what we did is there's this database of infant sort of faces with different emotions and the corresponding labels, which is called the CIF database. And then there's also this adult, much larger sort of adult database with emotion as well. So what we did is we tried different algorithms. We tried sort of a concavity based custom algorithm that we developed, a very sort of, we wanted to try compare sort of the more computationally intensive neural network model against a more simple model, just to see how much sort of more accuracy are we getting for that computation. So our simple algorithm consisted just of centering the nose, aligning the eyes. Oh, I should say, sorry, back up a bit. We got the sort of key points for the face using a standard sort of facial key point detection in OpenCV. I think it's called DLIP. If I'm correct, I'm forgetting the name of the algorithm itself that detects the sort of facial key points. But then once we got the facial key points, we did the following, and then we extracted. We store 6 key point values, and then we're basically fitting curves to the different sort of parts of the face, and then doing a principal component analysis on the curvature. And so that's what we call our sort of concavity algorithm. So we tried training the concavity algorithm on the infant data set, and then just as a control, sort of training it on the adult data set. And then we had the neural network that was sort of pre-trained on the adult emotion data set. And we found that sort of there's comparable performance between our custom algorithm and the neural network. The neural network isn't performing that much better than our custom algorithms. The next step would be to sort of retrain the neural network on infants, on sort of specifically on the infant data set, and see if that improves the performance much more. So just to show you, so that was just sort of a quick initial study that we did, but sort of where we're going with this is we've noticed that there are trends actually that sort of map between the emotional states of the infants and the body states. And this isn't something that has really been studied quantitatively in the literature. So we think it's sort of an interesting scientific finding. We find that sort of, for instance, the infant moves less, sort of the entropy of the infant movements are lesser during negative emotion states. And that is something that we're working on quantifying right now. So I've spoken mainly about the app, but about the sort of software or app-based study that we're doing, or basically using pure video to assess neurodevelopmental risk or neurodevelopmental delay. But right now, what we're doing is we also have developed this sort of 3D this sort of physical gym with multimodal sensors to collect data on these infants. So in addition to just video, which of course has the advantage that it's very accessible and can be easily deployed, we also wanted to find other measures of neurodevelopmental delay. So but let me first talk about the sort of 3D camera part of the 3D pose part of that. So on the mobile phone, of course, you can only get 2D pose, but we hope to be able to do sort of a 2D to 3D mapping using the mobile phones eventually. And for that, we want to have a lot of training data with different camera views on sort of our in-person cohort. So we have partnered with clinicians who will be taking this low-cost gym that we've developed with them when on their visits to infants, and they'll be collecting a lot of data on these infants, which then we can use to train our sort of software algorithms as well. So what we have here is many cameras. We started with around 10, but now we've come down to 7 based on, camera redundancies. We just wanted to optimize the camera placement. And this is a video of sort of the camera calibration. We have this light for syncing. We've developed this sort of flickering light to sync all the video cameras, and then we just use April tag sort of, these are called April tags, to do calibration. So the clinicians sort of do that when they go to visit the infants. This is sort of computer vision on different views. And then we stitch these together to get the 3D reconstruction of the baby's movements. And again, the goal of doing this is, one, of course, the scientific goal of understanding, how these 3D movements can help us classify infant risk. But then, of course, the sort of the physical gym will only be able to get so much data because there's the data won't be as high throughput as our app, for instance. So another goal is to get a good sort of 2D to 3D mapping with the data that we get through the gym, which we can then deploy in our software. So that's sort of the other goal. And then in addition to the sort of video-based now 3D sensing in the gym, we have a center of pressure mat that sort of that's lightweight and can measure the center of pressure. We have a sensorized toy that can sort of sense when the baby is holding it. And we have sort of 2 locations for the toy to see, how the baby uses the hands to interact with the toy, and also the legs to interact with the toy, like kicking and reaching and so on. And our multi-camera setup will also help us sort of capture the reaching movements in the presence of this toy, which adds an occlusion. So we needed more cameras to deal with those occlusions as well. And then just to test sort of the sensitivity of the center of pressure mat to different sort of baby proportions, we developed a robotic sort of baby that can actuate different arms, just to sort of play around with the weights of the different body parts and see how that affects the center of pressure measurements. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for your attention today. And I also want to thank my team. This is a really sort of multi-person project, multiple labs, multiple departments, and a lot of sort of powered by a lot of undergrads and master students as well. So I just wanted to feature all of them here. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Dr. Nidhi, for that wonderful talk. There's a question in the chat window from Meenakshi, and she says that medical data is often very sensitive to bias problems. Since you are talking about domain adaptation, how do you take care of any previous bias in the data of the model?
I see. I'm not sure what exactly they mean by sort of bias in the data. Could they elaborate maybe a bit? I'm not sure I fully understand. So is it, I see. Maybe they're trying to say, there are some of these famous problems where people have these images, and then there's like one little label that's differentiating. I don't know, I think this was images of brains or something, where or I think it was lungs, where there was this little sort of label which sort of distinguished between the healthy and the non-healthy label lung images, and then the algorithm just learned to learn that label or something like that. I guess the only way to be careful of that is to make sure that there isn't some really obvious bias like that. Other than that, we're basically using the information that these clinicians are using to assess risk, right? Which is just visually, how do these infants look like they're moving? So I don't really see the potential for much more bias than the current clinical sort of state of the art anyway, if that makes sense, because we're also using just purely visual data, and we don't have any clear indications like in the videos that the infant is at risk or something. Like, for instance, what if we're training on in a clinical setting, and the high risk infants have some sort of hand thing that they're wearing because they're in the neonatal care, like intensive care unit or something like that, but we don't have any of that. The videos are sort of otherwise very similar to each other.
There's another question from Elvin George, and he is asking, are there any delayed onset symptoms and disorders that are missed by only looking at 6-month, year-old babies? 6-month or an year-old babies, I guess. Yeah.
Right. So we've limited our data set to 1 to 6 months. The real reason for that is that our sense is that that's sort of the age group where there aren't really tools to assess sort of risk early on, and there is this real need. Sort of the infant brain is really plastic during that age. So there is actually a lot of potential that if some disorder is detected during that age frame, that there can be intervention that is really effective. So that's really why we focus in that age group. Because there aren't a lot of tools to work in that age group, and we think that sort of this large scale data driven approach has promise to sort of detect something in that time frame, and also just the fact that the brain is very plastic then. So that's why we chose to focus in that frame.
See. Yeah, so that brings me to another question essentially. So what can you apply maybe similar techniques for, say, babies that are not yet born, that are still in the mother's womb?
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess we haven't thought about that. That's definitely interesting. I guess it just seems like maybe a different problem to a certain extent, because you'd need something more than just video for it. And I don't personally know a lot of literature. Well, I am actually an engineer by training, so I rely heavily on our clinical collaborators to tell me sort of what's what in terms of the medicine of it. So I haven't come across any literature in that, but maybe there's something that can be done. Yeah.
All right, thanks a lot. So thanks very much again, Dr. Nidhi Sitapati. On
Yep.
behalf of everyone, I'll clap for you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great fun.
Thank you very much.